Okay, well now I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk more generally just about the archaeology of native North America from 5,000 years ago to present, partly because it's really important for us to understand the history of native North America, since we live here in North America. It's also a really good illustration of the fact that things weren't sort of one path or one size fits all. It's not as if every group just went from foraging to horticulture to suddenly agriculture and suddenly civilization. Instead, groups went in lots of different directions during this time period. Some kept foraging, but they became a lot more specialized. So that's where you see, for example, with Dena'ina groups here in the peninsula and in Anchorage, very, very complex adaptations to salmon and other types of fish populations that shaped Dena'ina society for centuries. So you have foraging groups developing new ways of hunting, and you have tribal groups developing, and you have also horticultural groups developing, and kind of almost empires, such as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Maybe empires is the wrong word, but very, very large confederacies. And so you have all of that going on in one continent, in native North America. So I think that's interesting and valuable to talk about. So, there's different ways of explaining origin stories, and I kind of started this whole unit by saying that. And there are, for example, the traditional sacred stories of different groups about that oftentimes root themselves in the land going back to time immemorial. And as somebody that studies the anthropology of religion and works with native groups, I take those sacred stories extremely seriously. And so when I talk about the archaeological theories of native North American settlement, I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to discredit other kinds of origin stories, but just present one type of origin story, which is the anthropological one. From an archaeological perspective, the Americas are believed to be one of the very last places that were settled by human beings. So human beings start in East Africa and move out from there, reaching Europe by about 45,000 years ago, Northern Europe 12,000 years ago, the British Isles a little over 1,000 years ago, Australia by about 65,000 years ago, China 45,000 years ago, and then you don't have entry into the Americas until really about 25,000 years ago. And the way this is determined is partly because it is assumed and understood that indigenous Americans originally came from Northeast Asia, from the Siberia region. And that was a theory that was proposed in the mid-1800s and especially in the early 1900s, but has gained widespread support within archaeology to the point where it's now by far and away the dominant theory for where how the Americas were settled was from Siberia, specifically during the time period when it was colder, so a large portion of the water was in polar ice caps, and so as a result you had essentially a land bridge, as it's sometimes called, the Beringia region, where you could walk from Siberia to Alaska. And we have some good archaeological evidence to suggest that there was people there at the time, and that then there's the assumption that, well, those people probably came here, and then that's where indigenous Americans came from. And there's some other forms of evidence other than just sort of the logical train of thought there to support that, one of which is it kind of matches our overall chronology of, if people are here about 40,000 years ago, and then this is open about 25,000 years ago, and then we have archaeological sites dating to about 15,000 years ago, it kind of just makes sense that this was the pattern of movement. It's not the only theory. There's one, for example, hypothesis called the Solutrean hypothesis that posits that the early settlement would have come from southern Europe, in part because of some of the similarities between technology here and technology there during this time period. That's not super widely accepted. The predominant view is a migration from Siberia, and that's partially supported by genetics. Genetics of ancient populations is extremely difficult, and it's a type of science that we're always sort of understanding more about it, and our understandings are evolving. So, for example, we now understand that at least some of the DNA of indigenous Americans traces actually not just to Siberian regions, but Central Asian regions. So the picture is complex, but as far as we can tell, the genetics seem to match better an origin from here rather than an origin from here. Others have proposed a settlement from sort of Southeast Asian moving outward in some sort of Polynesian settlement, although that's into the Americas, although that is not a well-accepted theory at all within archaeology for a number of different reasons. So that's kind of a theory of that, and then the question is when that happened. Well, it's about 20,000 years ago that region would have been open for people to come through. By the way, this is sort of a map of different archaeological cultures for Alaska, for different regions of Alaska, which I thought you might find interesting. And what I mean by different cultures archaeologically is that you have, for example, Paleo-Arctic, which has a specific kind of tools, and then Northern Archaic, which has a very different type of artifact, and so that you can tell that either the culture changed a lot, or perhaps just as likely a new group of people moved into the region. And then you have Arctic small tool tradition, Norton, Athabascan, Inupiaq. What you can see from this, and I don't need you to memorize this, but just to see how much complexity there is going on there, it's not as if at the same time as, for example, in Mesoamerica or the Middle East, you know, as these major civilizations are undergoing all these changes, it's not as if places like Alaska, where it was predominantly hunter-gatherer groups, were just sort of standing still, and it's not as if the hunter-gatherer groups that have persisted into the present are just some sort of like living relic of what was going on 10,000 years ago. Not at all true. There was massive technological and subsistence and language changes going on during this time, with entire cultures being displaced and replaced and transformed. By the way, so I told you the land bridge kind of theory. That's been challenged recently, in part because you have basically the theory for that to work. You have to try to understand where, as I was saying before, a lot of the water was in ice form, and a lot of that ice covered like all of Canada. So so archaeologists have to explain, well, if indigenous people originally came from Siberia and then spread throughout the Americas, how did they get from Alaska to everywhere else if there's a huge chunk of ice in their way? Well, the answer, as far as we can tell, is that there was an ice-free corridor around 12,000 years ago. Okay, problem solved. So then they go through the ice-free corridor and then spread throughout the Americas, and eventually as the ice melts out into Canada and eventually down into South America. And that worked pretty well when the earliest artifacts we could find were about 12 to 13,000 years old, the Clovis kind of artifacts. But the problem is that a couple of problems, one of which is that we're understanding now that probably this ice-free corridor was never completely ice-free. And also, so here's Gandalf saying, "You shall not pass on the ice-free corridor." And also, more problematically, there's archaeological sites that are older than this corridor was open. So unless, you know, people could like pole vault over a gigantic thing of ice, it starts to seem less likely that people could have gotten through this corridor and gotten past this ice to get down to places like Monteverde, where people may have been as early as 14,000 years ago, or places that are maybe even a little older, like 15,000 years old. So you're starting to get a lot more archaeologists propose that instead what happened was a coastal migration where people were using boats moving from Siberia or Eastern Asia, and then kind of moving through the island chain regions, kind of places like Aleutian Islands, and then down the coast into places like Washington and Oregon. So that's becoming a more predominant theory over time. No, I don't need you to like super memorize every detail of what I just said to you, but part of the point I want you to see is that even with science, the origin story is not settled. There may be an overwhelming consensus of the general place of origin and when things were generally settled, but there's debate. There's people disagreeing with each other. Science can change. Our understandings of the past can change. And I think that's okay. I think that's actually how science works, is that we develop ideas and then we test them, and sometimes the ideas were wrong, and then we get to better ideas. And then those better ideas sometimes turn out to be good but not great, and we come to even better ideas with time. So our understanding of human migration 10 years from now, 100 years from now, may be even different from what we're seeing right then. But this is sort of some of the anthropological consensus at this point. And I say, you know, why this matters, it's part of our origin story. Well, there's a lot of reasons it matters. But for us, as a nation, a multicultural nation where many people in our nation, especially many people in Alaska, are indigenous, this is, I think, a really important origin story to tell and to recognize and to talk about. But also just for the region as a whole, we should know the stories of our land. And part of the story is the archaeological story of our land. I think it's fascinating and important to understand those origins. But once the Americas get settled, it's not as if all indigenous groups adapt to this really complex, diverse landscape in the same way. Instead, what we see is that for the past 10,000 years within the Americas, or maybe 15,000 years, you see rapid diversification, groups going in all sorts of different directions. Some groups, like the groups in the Southwest and Northeast, develop horticulture, and you have, for example, pueblos of these like huge built adobe structures with these huge cornfields that are irrigated, or the Hohokam irrigation canals. You have Northeast groups like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. In areas like the Great Plains, you have groups like the Lakota, who it's somewhat up for debate whether or not there were horses prior to European colonization, but if you accept the dominant theory that there were not, then you have the Lakota originally as a hunting group sort of centered around the Great Lakes, who then over time migrates into the Great Plains when they gain access to horses and become a group that's entirely reliant on horses and nomadic bison hunting, and whose entire religious and social life is structured around that. You have, and thus the use of the teepee, because it's a very good, easy, transportable structure if you're having to move very fast to track a bison herd. You have groups like the Haudenosaunee, who in some ways couldn't be more different from the Lakota, with huge established villages, and then thousands of people meeting together in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy system, where you'd have these sachems, these groups of kind of elected, so to speak, leaders who would reach decisions by consensus. And by the way, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was and to some degree still is, but was 5 united nations that had 50 representatives who met together and were divided into 2 separate chambers as well as an executive branch. What does that sound like? Ding, 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 the U.S. government. So there's a lot of scholars who think that because of where the Haudenosaunee are located, and because of the similarities between them and the U.S. government, and because of very obvious contacts between Haudenosaunee people and the people that were writing the Constitution, there's what's called the Iroquois influence theory, that basically the American writers of the Constitution were drawing on Haudenosaunee government for some of their ideas about how the new government should be established. Very interesting. And then again, the Hopi people with their advanced adobe cities on top of mountains and matrilineal chief-based systems. And that's different still from the KWAKWAKA, or KWAKIUTL, as they're sometimes called incorrectly, of British Columbia, one of the many salmon-based sort of Pacific coastal societies, known among other things for the potlatch system, for totem poles, for advanced mask carving. So all of and for these complex chiefdoms that sometimes became competitive with each other, but in kind of a positive way. So these societies, right? That's just 4 of the 300 or so different languages and thousands of different local groups that existed prior to European colonialism, most of which still exist today. And we're going in all sorts of different directions in terms of how they adapted, what their cities, whether or not they had cities, whether or not they had towns, whether or not they had tribes or bands, whether or not they farmed. Things were complex and different and diverse, which is one of the reasons why, again, we say evolution does not necessarily mean progress, because it's not as if sort of the destiny of all cultures is to reach the sort of standard of agriculture or something like that. Instead, societies become sophisticated and adapted, going in many different directions. Sophistication and adaptation means different things for different groups, living in different environments and facing different problems and challenges. I kind of already made this point, which is that more people lived in Mesoamerican cities at the time of colonialism than European ones. So also to point out that although we tend to think about Native American archaeology as sort of disparate groups, small groups, tribes, bands, in reality there was actually some very large cities, including Mesoamerican cities, but also places like the Cahokia Mounds in modern-day St. Louis, Missouri, where you have these gigantic earthen mounds that were clearly like temple structures, and you had priesthoods and cities of thousands of people. I'd also like to point out that we sometimes think about the archaeology of Native America as sort of isolated groups, but instead what we see when we actually study the archaeology is that there was vast trading networks that spread across entire regions. So for example, we see macaw feathers from the central Mesoamerican rainforest popping up all the way up here in Hopi/Navajo religious ceremonies. And so trading was clearly going on all up and down this route, all over the Pacific Northwest, kind of centered on groups like the Klamath groups, all up and down California, trading salt and different things between Pacific coastal groups and into the Southwest. There were huge trade networks. There was also flow of cultural knowledge. And so there's warrior twin stories here. There's also warrior twin stories here. And although those may have arisen independently, what we think probably happened is that clearly religious stories and religious ideas were traveling between different cultures as groups migrated and interacted with each other. You also have languages that are related to each other, such as Uto-Aztecan, which stretches so there's languages here that are related to languages here. You have Athabascan, where you have languages in Alaska that are related to languages down here. So there was tons of migration, definitely, for certain groups. Other groups stayed in the same place for thousands and thousands of years, but there's definitely migrations of knowledge, and migrations of materials, and migrations of language. And some of the regions that we think of as divided were actually not really all that divided at all, but instead you had knowledge and materials going back and forth. Kind of a final note, by the way, kind of a somber note, since this, well, a somber note, a humbling note. We sometimes get kind of overly enamored with our own theories and think we have it all figured out. Okay, so a society turns to agriculture and develops kingdoms and empires. Cool, got it, makes sense. There's always going to be counter exceptions. Here's one. The Calusa were an R group in Florida. I say were an R because some will say that the Calusa were wiped out, but there's still people that claim descent from Calusa people. But certainly Calusa society was demolished in the wake of Spanish colonialism. But the Calusa previous to that, and when colonizers first entered Florida, were a group in Florida that was, you'd have thousands of people, you'd have a very strict hierarchy of the rulers, the elites, and then the commoners. And I believe there was also some slavery that was practiced in this society. So a very hierarchical society with large cities, but it was based not on agriculture, but on fishing. Abundant fishing of Florida's waterway that supported thousands of people in a very complex and hierarchical society that we could really think of actually as a kingdom with a true royalty. So it's not always as simple as our theories suggest, and just to kind of give ourselves a dose of humility.